Can you name main societal problems within the European Union that were created by the pandemic?
I think that the pandemic has learned us that Europe has wide gender gap and wide generation gap, and that problem has been especially visible during the pandemic, now post-pandemic period, even though we are still not there yet. Now I'll shortly elaborate the two. When it comes to generation gap, we saw that the youth is the one struggling among the most during the pandemic because the labor market got super saturated. There are not many quality jobs on the labor market, and the youth unemployment skyrocketed in some countries. On average at the EU level it's 15-16%, but we have Southern Europe countries that have youth unemployment above 30%. It means every third young European is not working, is not on the labor market. And just to be clear, so those are those young Europeans who actually do want to work. So the countries, the labor market is not providing sufficient number of jobs, and not to mention sufficient number of good quality jobs for them. So the pandemic has exposed those vulnerabilities to a greater extent than before. And then we can see that now the most vulnerable groups when it comes to other COVID-related things such as mental health situations and others are particularly the youth. And it applies both for the European Union and the Western Balkans. I think it's a global trend, but it's particularly exposed in those countries where inequalities are higher. Second, when it comes to gender, is also we have a situation where the healthcare was primarily run by women. And then the women were on the front line when it comes to pandemic. So this gender gap in lots of sectors that were affected by the pandemic was particularly visible also in Europe, where the women and their work is not equally valued nor appreciated. And even though they pay the biggest price when it comes to COVID, when it comes to the pandemic. So I think that these two things are not particularly well addressed within the European Union and the Western Balkans for that matter.
Yeah. So with regard to the European Union, maybe what instruments does it have to deal with these challenges, and were there any new instruments created? And maybe also in addition to that, is it the EU who should or will deal with it, or it's rather member states?
I think it's both. It's a task both for the EU and the member states. I mean, the situation quite varies across the EU member states when it comes to these things. But I think the two good initiatives are binding instrument for gender pay across the European Union. It's the EU initiative, and it's very much welcomed across the EU because it's staggering that in the 21st century in Europe we still have a gender pay gap for equal work. And it's absolutely unacceptable, and I think it's long overdue, but it's always welcomed when it comes. So I think that's one of the very concrete ways to be transparent about the pay and to pay equally men and women for equal work. When it comes to youth employment or unemployment that we talk now, there is a youth guarantee. It's a scheme that provides, and it's provided by the European Union. And speaking of the Western Balkans, it's successfully implemented in North Macedonia. Now there is an initiative in the next MFF, in the next 7-year budget of the European Union, to spread the implementation of youth guarantee in other Western Balkan states, which in essence provides paid internship, VET or other program upon graduation for young people. And it has been successfully implemented in North Macedonia. The youth unemployment has dropped after the introduction of the youth guarantee in 2019. So I think this is one of the very concrete ways when the EU and the member states, both of the European Union, but also in the Western Balkans, can actually step in their efforts and provide more funds that will be available for the implementation of the youth guarantee, because it has shown that it does deliver results and it provides greater opportunities for the youth.
So maybe can you also, in this connection, can you elaborate a little bit on how actually the pandemic affected directly the Western Balkans, and why should the EU care so much?
If the EU doesn't care, there will be other who cares. I think that's something that is repeated a million times, and I don't feel a need to elaborate more, because I think that everyone knows that if the void will never be empty, I mean, it's going to be filled by other actors. And the issue is that when filled with other actors, those are usually the actors that do not respect the values that we nourish in Europe, and that's quite the issue. So I think the EU did not provide sufficient assistance nor support for the Western Balkans during the pandemic, primarily in 2020, but also now we still see that the EU struggles to have a coherent, robust, tangible effects and results in the Western Balkans. The way why EU failed to support more can be found in different ways, be it in 2020 to provide ventilators and masks, or vaccine distribution in 2021. And I think that the consequences of the pandemic has shown one thing, and that is that the regional approach when it comes to solidarity, when it comes to tackling of the joint issues like the pandemic is actually the only way for weak economies and weak societies to deal with. We had the examples of extraordinary solidarity. We saw that when there were floods in 2014, when Serbia and Croatia sent their rescue teams to Bosnia, and the other way around when the flood wave came to Serbia. Now we saw similar things when it comes to masks. Nowadays we see the massive vaccination in Belgrade with people from North Macedonia and Bosnia, and that's beautiful. That's truly beautiful that the regional solidarity does exist. When the medical equipment or personnel was needed, there were exchanges between Bosnia and Serbia and North Macedonia and so on. So I really think that that's the way how the Balkans can go forward, if there is a truly something that provides for unified, prolific way of tackling common challenges and issues. Nowadays it's the pandemic, but tomorrow it's the brain drain, is the security concerns, or something else. I think that the pandemic has learned the lesson, and I do hope that the Western Balkans countries, but also the EU, has learned the lessons in a way that the solidarity and the joint approach pays off and brings the results. So let's hope that it stays.
Perfect. Yeah, maybe in this connection, in this interview, we're talking also about the conference on the future of Europe. How do you see maybe this conference actually, its potential for the Western Balkans, for their participation in the European Union, for any future enlargement? What can it bring?
I truly hope that the Western Balkans will be involved in the conference on the future of Europe. We saw that it's a cumbersome path to be taken and to go forward. Lots of issues institutionally, who will run the conference, what will be the agenda, and so on. I think that there are two preconditions for the conference to be successful. One is to be as inclusive as possible. So not to limit itself on the interinstitutional battles and stuff, but to truly engage with EU citizens and beyond, namely the prospective EU member states in the Western Balkans, and to engage on the question, what Europe do we want in 2030, in 2050 and beyond? So these are really the questions that can be answered by and for the European citizens. And then unless there is as the French had, le grand débat about all these issues that are on the table, then we won't have legitimacy nor will to implement these things. The second is tabula rasa when it comes to preconditions. So I think that really there can't be any limitations to what the conference can achieve. There can't be a limitation, there won't be a treaty revision. There can't be a limitation, we won't reverse qualified majority voting or this or that. So I think that if conference is to succeed, it truly needs to open up and to involve as many EU citizens as possible and beyond, and not to have any limitations when it comes to its results and its scope. I think that if you are open, if you brainstorm on the question, what Europe do we want, as I said, in 2030, in 2050 and beyond, that's the only way when the conference will be meaningful exercise of the EU institutions and the citizens to hear them and then to, based on their recommendations, either do treaty revisions or some other changes in the way the EU functions. We have now seen during the pandemic how much, and I spoke about it, how much the joint approach is important, both at the level of the Western Balkans, but also the EU. So there is something that comes from within, and that's now the request for a health competence at EU level, which was not the case before. When we see a crisis and when we point the finger at the direction of the European Union, and the European Union comes and says, look, I don't have the competence to do so, we see the genuine, the grassroots demand, okay, Europe, now you need to step up and deliver. Starting from the masks and the ventilators to vaccines to sharing the burdens of the health treatments and so on. I think that's the path for the Conference of the Future of Europe, and the pandemic is a great example why we need this. And I'll repeat again, for the conference to be successful and to be to deliver meaningful, far-stretching results, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to open up to all EU citizens and beyond in order to gather as many good quality ideas as possible, and not to have limitations when it comes to its potential results.
Right. Some experts also argue that probably the international role of the European Union will not be the main, priority during this conference, but maybe sort of what would you say is, need for, what is the need for the discussion about the EU's international role, maybe also in relation to the Western Balkans, how the Western Balkans see the EU?
The new commission, not so new anymore, was claimed to be the geopolitical commission. And I think now it's a great momentum for the European Union to push more for what has been coined as strategic autonomy, and to push it beyond on the agenda of the Conference for the Future of Europe. Because now that we have the political will to do things that we were afraid to do, such as joint military exercises or European army, or some other security reinforcements that we can think of, now is the momentum actually for Europe to beef up its aspects in security and to project itself as a geopolitical player. The geopolitics starts in its neighborhood, and I know that this has been heard a million times, but it's something that is proved yet again, especially in the Western Balkans. If the EU cannot be the great power, if the EU cannot be the key player in the town in the Western Balkans, then it cannot be anywhere. And I think for the EU to prove so, to prove its geopolitical component, it has to open the Conference for the Future of Europe to the citizens, to the think tanks, to the intellectuals from the Western Balkans, but also to project its values there, to project its hopes, to say, hey, if you really want to be part of the European Union, we are here to be partners. For tango, we need two. And then for the enlargement process, we also need two. So there needs more to be done in this direction. First, in the way how the EU communicates about its goals or its actions. So many examples that the citizens of the Western Balkans do not know what the EU has done or achieved. Everyone pointing to some other actors, such as Russia or China or Turkey, that have done or invested more, which is not the case. And second is actually some concrete actions on the political level about the involvement, inclusion of the Western Balkans in the EU processes. If you're part of the process, then you feel the process and the results as your own. And the only way for the Western Balkans to be part of the new Europe is to take part in its creation. So they are lagging behind for 70 years at the moment in the EU integration train, but let's jump now on that train and let's create the Europe of tomorrow, where you actually bring your ideas to the table and you say, this is the Europe I want to live or participate in 10, 20, 30, 50 years. I think this is the way how both the EU and the Western Balkans can go forward. And then coming back to your question, EU as a geopolitical player and geopolitics on the Conference of Europe agenda, this is the way, this is the example how the EU can prove its geopolitical component.
Maybe one last question for the conclusion. You spoke about the Western Balkans. Do you see same politics of the EU, feasible or necessary in the Eastern neighborhood countries?
Yes, the second next neighborhood that the EU really has to take care of and should project its geopolitics is the Eastern neighborhood. We saw a very fragile region. We saw a region with lots of turbulent events in 2020, including a war. And we see how the frozen conflicts, but not only the frozen conflicts, how much the lack of democracy and how much the lack of European approach in those 6 countries is actually bringing to the fragility of the region and bringing the instability of the region that can escalate from riots and protests and mass violence in Belarus all the way to Nagorno-Karabakh war. For the EU to be present and for the EU to be the player in the town again, it needs to step up its efforts. I think that the Eastern Partnership strategy that was published in March 2020 is not sufficiently ambitious. It does not look beyond the so-called 4 strategic pillars or clusters or priorities. And I think that for the EU to be for the EU to be the player in Kiev, in Minsk, in Tbilisi, it truly needs to offer the tangible and short-term results. For the EU to be taken seriously, it needs to have concrete actions on the ground. And the EU is actually the only one that can bring the democracy and prosperity to the region. But it has to be done in a way that is not imposed. It has to be done in a way that does not meddle with the internal processes. And it has to be done in a way that delivers concrete, tangible results to the citizens of Eastern Partnership countries. That's the only way when the citizens of Georgia, of Moldova, of Belarus, of Ukraine, and so on, can actually see what European integration, European ideas, European markets, European openness can mean and bring to the citizens.